Thank you very much, Anand, for a wonderful event that has been put together. First, I'll give a background as to how this book came about. I was researching, I have been researching something for 15 to 20 years, which I call the UTurn Theory, which is going to be the next book. And the UTurn Theory is, having lived in the United States for 40 years, I have done a longitudinal study of people who are very interested in Indian culture and very immersed in Indian culture. But over a period of years, they shift. They change their relationship with Indian civilization and also with their own Western civilization. And I wanted to find out why that happens. And I interviewed a whole number of people. A good place to find such people is in yoga centers. There's about 25 million Americans who do yoga. So going to yoga centers, interviewing the teachers who've been in it for decades, and then some of the more advanced students, gives you a good snapshot. And then there's other writers and thinkers and intellectuals one can also discuss with. So a sort of theory that has been evolving is this UTurn theory, and every version of the theory that I developed, I would then go back and replay it to the audience to see what they think and generate more arguments and then come back and do a better theory. So in its current version, the theory says that there are 5 stages or 5 modes of relationship among Westerners who have decided to take a serious journey into Indian civilization. 5 modes. And I call them stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they are not chronological in all cases. So the word stage is not a linear stage, like stages in life kind of thing. Think of them as a theater which has 5 stages. And on each stage there is a context and in which the person is living. And so when I say a person moved from stage 1 to stage 2, it means that he moved from a certain context, a certain situation to a different situation. So it is a stage in the theater sense, a stage. So this means that people can move in any arbitrary sequence, and the number of the stages is not a chronological number. But often it is chronological. So the way I describe it is, stage 1 is where the Westerner is very immersed in Indian culture, spiritual tradition. This happened a lot in the 60s. People came and lived in Rishikesh and Haridwar, and they became followers of many different movements, Neem Karori Baba and Swami Muktanand and all these, Sri Aurobindo, Auroville. And I've interviewed those children of the 60s and 70s. And I call that stage 1, and that is discipleship, immersion, a kind of wanting to let go of one's previous identity and get into this new worldview as fully and deeply as possible. That's sort of stage 1. And then some people stay there. I mean, I've met a lot of people who are in stage 1 for a very long time and they're very happy. And then there's some who move to stage 2. And stage 2 is where what is the Indian context and the Indian historicity is sort of decontextualized and turned into a sort of generic worldview, generic knowledge system, sort of Oprah Winfrey spirituality, Deepak Chopra spirituality, sort of stage 2, New Age. And good reasons are that a lot of reasons are given. Some of them are that this baggage, I don't really want that. I want spirituality, I don't want the cultural context to go with it. Some people had bad experiences. Maybe it was too hot or too many mosquitoes, or they got harassed or came across some horrible person, and so they kind of recoiled and said, okay, I want what the tradition offers, but I don't want the rest of all this. Some people had a fight with their guru, or they found the guru is not as good as they thought he was. found something else about him. And so they sort of, but they still like enough about the tradition not to get out of it completely. So they go in this generic, universal tradition. And another reason often heard is that it universalizes the tradition because now more people can access it. So when I talk to some people who've taken Indian traditions and turned it into their own patent, like mindfulness meditation, which was Vipassana, or lucid dreaming, trademarked by Stephen DeBurge at Stanford, was Yoga Nidra. And he mentions it. So if you talk to him privately, if you raise the issue, he mentions it. Or when he goes to neuroscience conferences and cognitive science conferences, he presents his own discovery of lucid dreaming as a state and does a lot of research, gets the government grants, and doesn't say one thing about anything to do with Indian origins or Indian traditions. And when I meet such a person offline and they tell me all about 20 years he lived with this Swami and did that, and then I say, why didn't you say it over there in the audience? And the answers are things like, I'll never get a research grant because they'll think I'm studying some Eastern quackery or weird stuff. It's not science. I have to remove things which we suspect, and I have to replace it with scientific terminology. Or it could be that I can popularize it to a wider audience. So I'm actually removing the context by making it available, or I'm making it more user-friendly, or Westerners will be more comfortable with it. So I started looking at this in the 90s to see what are some of the factors. And then there's an ego factor. The person steps in as the originator. So for instance, in the state of Massachusetts, they have mind-body healing and spiritual healing as an optional course you can elective in medical school. So if you take that elective, there is a segment called the history of spiritual healing, mind-body healing. And the history is defined in terms of the Westerners who have U-turned. So it says, Herb Benson brought this idea, but actually Herb Benson studied transcendental meditation, did his experiments on TM meditators, was able to find some correlates between neurological states and meditation, wrote his papers, became very famous, he's a Harvard guy. So all these people. They are the chapter headings, they are the pioneers in this history. And where they got it from is not mentioned. So this is sort of stage 2, where a neutral territory, a kind of universal space is created, decontextualizing the origins, replacing it with either some new pioneers are created, or it's said that this is found in every tradition, and some remote mention somewhere, even one line is used to sort of expand that line as to what it might have meant. So the third stage is like we now have something called Christian yoga. So now the first stage is Indian context. Second stage is decontextualizing. And third stage is recontextualizing. So the second stage is unstable for some reason. And that was a very interesting question I wanted. Why couldn't people just live in stage 2? Why couldn't they just live in stage 2? What is it that pulls them back towards the historical identity that they have been given from childhood? Could be Judaism, could be Christianity, could be non-religious, Western Enlightenment, science, but we in the West have science, so we cannot keep up with the baggage of all that terminology of the East, and so we want to recontextualize it. So Francisco Varela, who was ordained as a Buddhist by the Dalai Lama and spent a lot of his time learning all kinds of meditation in the Madhyamika tradition, wrote great books. Then he U-turned and came up with neurophenomenology. So the whole thing was there was a new vocabulary created called neurophenomenology, of which he's considered the pioneer. So I had meetings with him, and he said, what would have been the benefit if we had continued using the Indian Dharmic tradition terminology and referring to the terminology. So I said, if you have a fruit tree and you want the fruits, if you keep nurturing the roots, it will keep giving you more harvests. But if you harvest the fruit and trash the roots or cut it off, then the harvest you got is the final harvest. So you're making the assumption that there isn't any more you can get. But maybe there is a lot more that you haven't got yet. Maybe there's a lot more that you don't understand yet. So he says, but he was quite sure that he's got it all. So I said, you tell me, where is the neurophenomenology yoga today? Give me a center where I can learn. I can go and check it, live there for a few years, and become a practitioner of whatever it is you're teaching, such that I expect to have some experiences and over a period of time evolve myself. So he was very thoughtful. He said, frankly, we don't have such a place. So I said, that is because the roots are cut off. So what you have is the intellectual understanding, an intellectual map of what goes on, but you don't have the experiential laboratories to keep the tradition going. So he actually promised, he said, okay, now I cannot reverse the U-turn, but I will write about Buddhism as the foundation of neurophenomenology. And then unfortunately he died. A couple of years later he had cancer, so he died. And that never happened, but that's how it goes. So in stage 3, there is a recontextualization. So it's no longer the neutral space of stage 2. There is a recontextualization either into Judaism or into Christianity or into Western models of science. Western, very specifically, not just science, but Western science. And new heroes and new pioneers and new people who think they should get the Nobel Prize. So new heroes and new guys are created who are considered the founding fathers of this new thought. But actually this new thought is old thought, and that's the issue. So that's stage 3. So I go a lot to yoga centers. In the 80s, they were not at all having any doubt about chanting Om or Sanskrit mantras, and they had they would light a lamp, and they had images of deities and stuff like that. And then 10 or 15 years after that, I found that they were sort of neutralized, like YMCA yoga, kind of like secular yoga. So all that is considered not appropriate. And then in the last 5-10 years, there's a huge movement of recontextualizing it as Christian yoga and other kinds of such yoga. So I started interviewing the people there to find out what is it that pulls you back. And the documentation of U-turns after this research started has become so huge that I intend to write, I have planned 6 volumes after this volume. So this volume is set in the stage. The next volume will be the theoretical framework. And then there are so many bodies of knowledge where U-turns have happened, like the U-turn from Sanskrit into Western linguistics. This is the study of Indology. And I know Vladimir has done some work in that. The study of Indology, the study of Sanskrit leading to the emergence of Western linguistics and a whole lot of influence then of structuralism of Saussure into post-structuralism and the birth of postmodernity is a huge U-turn. It's not of one individual but a whole group of people. And then Jungian thought. William James, highly influenced by both Vivekananda and Buddhists at Harvard. Not well known, but these are things that I'm digging out. And a whole lot of cognitive science today, neuroscience today, influences in medicine, and so on. So there's different volumes that focus on different kinds of domains. And a whole volume on Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber and his U-turn over 20 books he's written. I've read all of them, summarized them for my own notes, and classified them as different stages of a U-turn. Of course, he classifies his journey in terms of his own ego. He says that evolution goes through Wilber 1, Wilber 2, Wilber 3, Wilber 4, and now it is Wilber 5. And he puts Sri Aurobindo as Wilber 2. Sri Aurobindo's state of consciousness was Wilber 2, which he exceeded in Wilber 3 and found flaws in it and things that would be very problematic. And what I find is that those are flaws based on a distortion of his readings. Those are flaws on you assuming a view of Advaita Vedanta which actually Sri Aurobindo rejected. A view of Advaita Vedanta is sort of otherworldly and not progressive and things like that. Putting words in Sri Aurobindo's mouth which is not legitimate kind of critique. But before an audience that's not that well informed, which is what most of his audience is, he gets away with it. So I want to kind of set that record straight. So I want to have a whole volume on Sri Aurobindo's, there's Ken Wilber on this, as part of this UTurn theory. So then, after this stage 3, or not after, because I remember I told you it's not chronological, but at another stage that happened at some point in time, is actually a criticism and dismissive approach, trashing the source. Source is primitive, it's abusive, it's not rational, it cannot go forward. We are progressive. The Hegelian idea that we, the West, are progressive. We can take it forward. This tradition is better in our custody. They may have originated it, but we can take it forward. We'll actually help them. Because it's like, it's yours, but I'm a better trustee of it and a better custodian of it. You should thank me because I'll give it glory. And it's sort of sometimes very blatant trashing of the source, hugely blatant. And some of these are speakers that are paraded all over India as big shots. But if you look at the works that they don't mention in India, it's full of trashing the source. So that is sort of stage 4. Some people don't go into it. They just go into a very positive appropriation without trashing the source. I've come across a lot of U-turns who say, nothing against anybody, nothing wrong with the source tradition, but I'm more comfortable being in my Western identity. And that hasn't, so that raises the issue, what is more comfortable about it? That becomes part of this new book, this Being Different book. And then just to close the U-turn, there is also a stage 5, when this new westernized reformulation of Indian thought, with the Indianness disguised and raised, gets re-exported to India. So you have Howard Gardner nowadays going around giving talks, and Infosys in Bangalore and IIT Madras, and he's talking about his multiple intelligences. And I have found a huge influence of planes and parts of being in a formulation of multiple intelligences. Yeah? It's a huge amount of work to figure this out and to confront it. I found that a lot of theater, some of the new modern theater in Europe is the result of people who came in the 50s and 60s and studied Natyashastra, and then they brought back, and then they went through this struggle where they wanted to preserve the Indianness. So there's a guy called Grotowski, and he died several years ago, and I got a research assistant to go and look up his archive in Italy and in Poland and translate it and so on. So the person is very loyal to the tradition, to the Indian tradition, but his Western audience are not as loyal. So he goes through a period of really trying to be as Indian and as loyal as he can, but he loses the battle. He dilutes it gradually because of market demand. They want him in this academy, but he can't teach it a certain way. He has to teach it for a new audience. Publishers and people who want his talks and videos, or I mean not videos in those days, but talks, and promote him as a speaker, encourage them to get rid of all that stuff, that baggage. So there is a whole process. You can see all that transition going on, and now his students are some of the pioneers of Western dance. And only a very knowledgeable person will pick it up and be able to say that this is coming from Natyashastra. And you talk to the people directing it, and they've never heard of Natyashastra, and they've never heard of any of this stuff. But you go back to Grotowski's own experience, his own early writings, and you find it very clearly there. So I found so many such examples. I found the U-turn of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot studied Sanskrit at Harvard, and some of his best poems, The Wasteland, the Four Quartets, are actually literal translations from the Upanishads, whole paragraphs translations. Someone called Cleo Kearns, who's an associate of mine, lives in Princeton, did her PhD on T.S. Eliot's, the Indian influence on T.S. Eliot, and she published a book, Cambridge University Press, called T.S. Eliot and Indic Traditions. And we got the rights to publish it in India. We did that some years ago. And she went and lived with Eliot's widow to have access to his personal diaries, which nobody had studied. And his personal copy of Gita and his personal copy of Upanishads filled with, on the margins, taking the Sanskrit and his English translation, and you can take that handwritten translation of his. Those are the verses in his poems. So it's very clear. And then T.S. Eliot's reason for U-turn is a marvelous confession, which helped me a lot. He says, in one writing, he says that this deep insight and into a profound civilization, profound philosophy that is contained in Sanskrit, makes the Western philosophers look like schoolboys. That's a quote from him. That's at one stage. Then, some years later, he says that he's really interested, he's toying with the idea of going all the way into this journey and moving to India. He considered relocating to India, T.S. Eliot, in the early part of the 20th century. And so he's toying with, it's a big jump, and he says, the price I'll pay is I'll no longer be an Englishman, no longer be an American. I cannot be both. It's not dual citizenship. I have to just let go of my identity, which is built on a sense of history, and I have to plunge into this. And am I willing to do that? He's very honest in saying this. And then he writes that he decided that he will not cross that line, and he will be a secure Christian American. So in his middle years, he gets re-baptized. Very unusual for a person to get re-baptized. To sort of almost like cleanse and make sure that nothing contaminant has stuck there. To sort of re-clean and become properly Christian. And also, ironically, a public ceremony in Harvard to re-baptize a grown-up man. Sort of like, okay, I've gone into that, but now I'm back and I want to reclaim something. And he never crashes, so he never goes to the stage 4 mode. He never finds anything wrong with it. He just says, I just want to be in this identity. And then he continues his studies, Sanskrit, but with a safety net around him that it will not pull him in too much. Because previously he was drawn in so much that he could have just lost his original bearings as a Westerner. But now, having built this shield of being publicly baptized and reclaimed this identity, he feels that, okay, now I'm not vulnerable to this tradition. Now I'll study it from far as their tradition, kind of. So he reconciles this middle stage by U-turning, but a very honest U-turn. And Jung has an interesting U-turn. In the 1930s, he is teaching Patanjali Yoga Sutra as Patanjali Yoga Sutra. In Zurich, he has summer institutes teaching courses on Kundalini Yoga, chakras. He calls it like that. And he's teaching all these texts without any pretense. He's also having a simultaneous argument with bishops in Christianity, because he's proposing a reformulation of Christianity without the history-centrism. He's proposing a reformulation of Christianity where it's sort of like a Dharmic tradition, but reinterpreting the Bible in a Dharmic way. And the bishop's not very happy with it. So he's sort of stuck in the middle. He's having arguments, he's interacting with both sides. He's doing this Samudra Manthan with both opponents. Sort of like I have to do also. Because I have to do my Manthan with Indian traditionalists who are not happy with one little interpretation or another little interpretation, and then I'm doing this manthan with Westerners at the same time. So I'm doing two. He does that. And then he reaches the conclusion that for Westerners, the upper two chakras are unsafe. He says the upper two chakras, which is where you have to give up and you have to transcend, the ego is transcended, the separateness is gone and there is a unity, is something he could not scientifically verify for himself, and therefore he does not think it could be true. So he's sort of the reference point of what he has achieved through these practices is up to the first 5 chakras. So the 6th and 7th chakra is not valid, and therefore there must be some kind of a strange pathology among the yogis who claim to have achieved that. He talks about it. And he says that it would be dangerous for Westerners to practice yoga unsupervised by somebody who will limit how far they should go, somebody who will tell them these are the boundaries which are safe. And if you don't have such a person and you just go uncontrolled, you could get into these spaces and weird things could happen. So he left it there. Some people say that close to his death he did believe in reincarnation. His idea was karma, yes. Reincarnation, no. So how do you make sense of that? Well, the karma does not influence an individual journey, which would be a reincarnation, but the collective journey. So the karma is a deposit into one account of everybody, and that affects everybody's future. But there is no you per se as a jivatma coming back. So, but some people say towards the end he reconsidered it. I don't know. So anyway, so these are some of the examples and case studies I went through. Now, something interesting happened 2 years ago. I always give my book drafts to a lot of people to read and give me comments. And I'm so happy that I went through many iterations. I give it to 10 people from various traditions and get them to comment. And some of them write 50-page critiques, very helpful to me. So somebody who's a sort of academic psychologist and works on the cutting edge of cognitive science and social psychology, his comment on the U-turn draft was that you are bringing in too much philosophy to answer the question, why people U-turn? If you remove the why people U-turn, and just describe the U-turn as a phenomenon, as a bit of social anthropology of people, it'll be easier to read. And your U-turn model, if you just remove this heavy bit about, philosophical, how they cannot handle an integral unity, or they cannot handle the tattvamasi, and all that, if you remove those very heavy things, then the U-turn becomes a nice piece of work in social psychology of the Westerner. So it's a social psychology of Westerners who go on a journey into India, and it's a piece of work that would be well received. So this is his advice. So I decided to take the advice because I also feel the U-turn book was too complex, and I pull out all the philosophy on why people U-turn, what is incompatible, what is not digestible into the West, what is it that he cannot keep as part of his own being, and that he must give up. Like in the case of Jung, his 6th and 7th chakra is not digestible, and so he has to give those up. So what are these things I had addressed them in a philosophical sense. So I pulled that out, and what remains will now be edited and turned into my next U-turn book. But what I pulled out was very sad that I pulled this out, because it was nice, it was good stuff. That is where I was addressing the question, what is so different that is sort of an irreconcilable difference philosophically in terms of the underlying axioms of cosmology. And I felt that maybe this should be a separate book. So that's the origin of this book. So this book is sort of a preface to the U-turn, more for philosophical people, to pave the way so that when I write the U-turn, I don't have to keep answering the question, what is irreconcilable? What happens to the person at the U-turn moment? When he collides, he reaches some boundary, some invisible boundary he reaches, and there he has to bounce back to his original identity, historical identity. What is not acceptable to him?